And welcome back to Consumer Choice Radio, broadcasting here on the Big Talker and Sauga 960 AM. We're speaking with Tanja Porčnik. She is the co-founder and president of the Visio Institute, a think tank in Slovenia. She's written many different topics, many different papers, a great scholar to have on the program. Tanja, thanks so much for taking the time to be on the show.
Thank you for having me.
So we wanted to get more of a background for our listeners as to your work, what Visio Institute does, some of the things that you've been researching. I know that there are a lot of great papers that we're going to link to in our show notes so that people can read that. But give us, some insight as to what you research on a daily basis.
Yes, so the Visio Institute is a public policy institute in Slovenia. We don't cover just public policy in Slovenia, but as any other EU member country, we are, entangled with the entire European Union. So we cover those countries too in many of our publications and other products that we produce. We focus on so many issues. It depends what is current. At the moment, of course, it's COVID-19 and human rights related to that issue, and also how, what kind of measures Slovenian government and other governments in Europe are taking to combat the virus and the spread of it.
And on that note, that kind of axis between human rights, human freedom, and the pandemic, in your eyes, how has the pandemic actually affected the treatment of human rights or the advancement of human freedom?
So my research area, I forgot to mention before, is focusing on, I would say, data approach to human rights and liberties. So it's something that is a recent development in academic field, something, because it's not that this has not been explored. It was, but with the different tools. In the past, there were a lot of studies that were based on qualitative methods. I particularly, with cooperation with other authors and institutions, are now focusing more on qualitative methods. And so we are using mixed methods mostly to evaluate how, not just how, what's the level of human rights in individual countries, but also what kind of impact measures in individual countries have on this level. In that regard, when it comes to COVID-19, the pandemic has kind of turned everything upside down, or kind of put us in a uncharted territory. Not really, because the world has experienced pandemics before, but this was so long time ago that the world experienced something like this, that maybe only some of us know what occurred, kind of can draw lessons from those times. Other than that, people and also decision makers are struggling with, not just what this virus is all about, how it develops, where it came from, what it means for our health, but and also, of course, for the healthcare system, but also what kind of measures to put in place, especially in regard to my research, not to trample too much on human rights and liberties of the people. Basically, what is that, borderline to where governments can go, and individual countries are, of course, they are united mostly that these measures should be proportionate, should be, of course, legal, should take into consideration that, there are human beings on the other side, but at the same time, every measure that is taken is kind of testing that limit. Of course, we can all be critical of the governments. In hindsight, we can all say, this government has went too far. But I would say that many countries have taken a very conservative route when it comes to the how far they have went with these measures.
We're speaking with Tanja Porčnik of Visio Institute here on Consumer Choice Radio. Tanja, I have a question. I'm going to be quoting from one of the papers that you came out with recently, Access to Information in Times of Crisis. I think it's very interesting, definitely a lot of great comparisons. And there's a quote in there that's blurted out towards the end. Upholding individual liberty is the first and prime responsibility of a government in a liberal democracy. And you have many examples throughout the paper where you're talking about some of the restrictions that were basically taken by the Chinese Communist Party and some European countries, and a lot of comparisons there. And I think this is leading us to a kind of new question is, what is the role of government in this kind of public health, emergency and pandemic? Because it's a lot of us are seeing many powers being taken away from individuals or from localities, a lot of powers being entrenched in governments that hasn't before. What are your thoughts on that?
So first, on the access to information, this was a very, I would say, hot topic at the beginning of the pandemic, the COVID pandemic. As I was discussing earlier, governments were at that time, in the first few months, testing how far they can go, how far basically they can work without people's consent, on people's knowledge of what the government was doing. They were taking decisions without consulting with the people, without informing them what they're doing. And of course, the people didn't take it. They immediately, it depends. In Europe, this is, in Europe, we say access to information. In the United States, is Freedom of Information Act that is put in place. It's like different countries, especially liberal democracies, have different legislation that prevents government from keeping information, public information from the people. And especially in times of emergency, and that's what paper was concluding that you mentioned, it's crucial that people in such times have access to information, know what the government is doing, what measures are taking, and the reasoning behind them. This is paramount, not just because people are then aware of what the government is doing, but because in this case, many people don't understand this. There is a difference between war and emergency situation that we are currently experiencing. In war, you don't really communicate information in this regard in order for the entire population to follow and actually be part of the measures. Because right now in pandemic, we really need the government has to appeal to the public for the public to actually follow those measures, because we have seen many countries where governments have been too aggressive in terms of not communicating well, going way too far, and then the people, behind their private walls, or where no one could see them, have not followed these measures in order to contain the spread of the virus. So it is crucial for the government, and not just to inform the public what it's doing, but actually to bring the public on its side to fight the pandemic all together. So everyone steps together to fight it. And when I'm mentioning this, also I remembered just a call we issued last week to all political parties in Slovenia, and it was a public call for all political parties to step together to fight this pandemic, because not just in Slovenia but in many countries, political parties are just playing their usual political games, fighting for the turf, and forgetting that right now the most important thing is for the entire nation to step together to fight the pandemic together.
Mm-hmm. I think you raise a really important distinction between war and a pandemic, and I think that policymakers maybe too often forget that there's a difference. I think, that's a really important distinction, and I say that in the context of, so recently in Canada, the government will not disclose the terms of their agreements or the prices they paid in procuring vaccines. And so that is obviously a huge disservice to the Canadian voter. It also has the really uncomfortable impact of fueling crazy conspiracies and people who believe all sorts of really insane things about the vaccine, all of which are not true. But it really adds fuel to the fire. in that regard. What are some examples that you can think of where governments have maybe gone too far in suppressing information or trying to crack down on information?
Well, all authoritarian governments around the world, China was mentioned before. China is not doing, it's not handling pandemic in any other way that it's handling any other issue that they perceive as a threat to the government, to the existence of the Communist Party. So all authoritarian regimes are restricting access to information. But then also liberal democracy, as I mentioned earlier, try to go down that path. But luckily, the international community stepped up very quickly. In the case of an example that comes to my mind is in case of Hungary, that went with emergency measures way too far because it imposed indefinite emergency measures that were not proportionate. The international community stepped up, not with threats, but rather to say, hey, this is going too far. Maybe, you should reconsider because you are harming your own people with that, So, and as mentioned before, all countries are they can learn from each other. Because there is no, perfect recipe right now. The recipe to deal with a crisis like this, we can of course learn from past pandemics, past crises when humanity dealt with issues like this on a great scale. But then at the same time, right now we are all in it, and we can all learn from it. And I always appeal to governments. Maybe you have misstepped on something, but you can always call your friend in a neighboring country or in any other country. Just call them up. They all know each other more or less. Ask them for best practices. Ask them how they are dealing with this. And if only governments were doing that, because we scholars, we are following. We try to follow as many countries as possible when on a certain topic, and we notice that sometimes just feels that national governments are kind of blind to what's going on in other countries, but I don't think it's intentional. I think they are also occupied with the crisis at home, that they don't really reach out. And now, because of the pandemic, they don't also meet in person so much. They don't even, they don't, in the European Union right now, they don't have consultations. They are kind of, secluded to their own country. And so that kind of dialogue has been missing. And that's unfortunate, because that kind of dialogue can help all of us implement best practices.
And Tanja, in our last minute, I just wanted to ask, what are some of the other topics of research that you'll be focusing on, and what can we really look forward to? I know there's a lot of big questions that were discussed today and that you're researching, but it'd be great to get an insight into what you're working on next.
Sure. So one topic for sure that I'm on the lookout is how economic freedom and the level of economic freedom that we enjoy in individual countries is contributing to the successful fight against coronavirus, because many people wonder whether having economic freedom actually contributes or is detrimental to this fight. Well, my bet is that it does help significantly, but we will see, because studies like this take a little bit. But then also on how coronavirus and the measures that have been taken have put at disadvantage minorities, because those that are the most vulnerable in our society. Are they left behind? Are not just it's not enough to just for the governments to pass legislation that is helping them financially, but otherwise they are secluded in their homes. There are situations where children, women, or other minorities, they are at a disadvantage just because of the pandemic, because what kind of situation pandemic has put them in. So I'm going to be interested in that topic.
We've been speaking with Tanja Porčnik. She's the co-founder and president of the Visio Institute, a think tank in Slovenia. You can follow her on Twitter at Tanja, Porcnik. Tanja, thanks so much for coming to the program.
Thank you.